Hey guys! Tonight we are stepping into one of the most unsettling and quietly powerful passages in the book of Genesis. So before you get comfortable, take a gentle moment, like the video, and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And please let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Tonight we are not rushing anywhere. We are standing still in the quiet aftermath of destruction. The story opens after one of the most dramatic judgments in the Hebrew Bible. Sodom and Gomorrah are gone. The cities that once stood in the fertile plain have been reduced to smoke and ash. Fire and sulfur have fallen from the sky. The land that once appeared lush and well-watered now bears the marks of irreversible ruin. This is not just the destruction of buildings. It is the collapse of a world. Lot escapes with his 2 daughters. His wife does not survive the journey. She looks back and becomes a pillar of salt, frozen in a moment of longing for what was lost. Lot and his daughters move away from the cities and settle first in Zoar, a small town spared from destruction. But even there, safety does not last. Fear follows them. The memory of divine judgment hangs heavy in the air. Lot becomes afraid to remain in Zoar, perhaps fearing that judgment might spread, or that hostility might rise against him as the lone survivor from Sodom. So he leaves the town. He takes his daughters into the hills. They settle in a cave. This detail matters. A cave is not a home. It is shelter at best, isolation at worst. There are no neighbors, no elders, no community, no structure. There are no familiar rhythms of daily life. Everything that once gave shape to their existence has vanished. Their world has narrowed to stone walls, shadows, and silence. The daughters look around and see nothing but emptiness. They believe the world as they knew it has ended. In their minds, there are no men left to marry them. No future households to join, no continuation of family lines. They are living in a world stripped of possibility. The biblical text does not describe their emotions in detail, but the situation itself speaks loudly. Trauma has settled in. They have witnessed mass destruction. They have lost their mother. They have been uprooted from their society. They are isolated with only their father, an aging man who carries his own grief and fear. It is in this setting that the daughters begin to reason among themselves. Their concern is lineage. In the ancient Near Eastern world, family continuation was not simply a personal desire. It was survival. A woman without children faced vulnerability. A family line that ended meant erasure. Identity, inheritance, and memory all flowed through descendants. To have no offspring was to disappear from history. The older daughter speaks first. She observes that their father is old. She believes there is no man left on earth to come into them according to the custom of all the earth. This statement reflects their perception, not necessarily objective reality. Their world has shrunk so completely that they cannot imagine alternatives. They form a plan. They will make their father drink wine. They will lie with him so that offspring may be preserved through him. The Bible recounts this with striking restraint. There is no embellishment, no dramatic commentary. The daughters act. The father drinks. He is unaware of what happens. The text emphasizes his lack of knowledge. This occurs on two separate nights. The older daughter conceives. Then the younger daughter conceives. There is no celebration, no justification offered by the narrator. The events are presented plainly, almost starkly. This is not sensational storytelling. It is unsettling precisely because of its calm tone. For a modern listener, discomfort arrives immediately. Questions surface almost instinctively. How could this happen? Why is it told this way? Where is the condemnation? Where is the voice that explains what to think? This reaction is natural. The story violates deeply held moral boundaries. It confronts us with actions that feel disturbing and wrong. It challenges expectations of clarity in biblical storytelling. The unease does not dissipate quickly. Instead, it deepens as we sit with the text. The Bible does not pause to reassure us. It does not insert a moral summary. It allows the weight of the moment to remain. This is where the ethical labyrinth begins. From the daughter's perspective, their actions arise from desperation. They see no future, no protection, no social structure. They believe extinction of their family line is imminent. In their cultural framework, bearing children is not optional. It is duty, survival, continuity. This does not make their actions righteous, but it reveals how necessity is perceived in moments of collapse. When people believe there are no alternatives, moral reasoning becomes distorted. The daughters do not frame their plan as rebellion. They frame it as preservation. Understanding this does not require approval. It requires context. Ancient Near Eastern society placed immense weight on lineage. A woman's security was tied to her relationship to a household. Widows and childless women faced poverty and danger. Family continuity was not symbolic. It was practical and existential. In this world, women rarely had independent paths to survival. Marriage and childbirth were not simply social milestones. They were lifelines. The daughters, isolated and traumatized, interpret their situation through this lens. The text remains silent on divine response. God neither speaks nor intervenes. This silence is unsettling. Many biblical stories include explicit judgment. Here, there is none. There is no neat moral resolution, no clear hero or villain. This is not a story of good versus evil. It is a story of fractured humanity acting under pressure. Discomfort becomes a teacher here. It refines how we read Scripture. It reminds us that the Bible does not sanitize human behavior. It records desperation without softening it. It trusts the reader to engage honestly. Gentle understanding emerges not from excusing actions, but from recognizing trauma. The daughters have lost everything familiar. Their world has collapsed. Their reasoning reflects fear, not malice. This story reveals the human condition with painful clarity. When stripped of safety, people act in ways they never imagined. Fear narrows vision. Survival instincts override long-term reasoning. Moral certainty becomes fragile. Reflection follows naturally. What shapes our ethical clarity? How much of our virtue depends on stable circumstances? What happens when those supports vanish? Ancient wisdom reaches into the present. Modern parallels appear quietly. Refugees, survivors of disaster, families under extreme pressure. Ethical boundaries are still tested when resources vanish and fear dominates. Difficult texts matter because they prevent shallow faith. They demand engagement rather than avoidance. They deepen compassion without dissolving responsibility. Even the darkest stories offer insight when approached with openness. They remind us that Scripture speaks not only to ideals, but to reality as it is lived. They teach patience, humility, and attentiveness, and so the story remains open, not resolved, not concluded, simply present, waiting to be held with care. Rather, the silence inside the cave becomes the setting for what follows. There are no witnesses, no voices of counsel, no wider community to interrupt the flow of thought. Only the slow passing of time and the shared understanding between the two daughters that their situation feels permanent and without remedy. The biblical text does not describe lengthy debate or emotional struggle, but it does show deliberate planning, carried out quietly and intentionally. The daughters speak to one another. Their words are practical rather than emotional. They observe their father's age. They reflect on the absence of men. They measure their future by what they believe no longer exists. Their reasoning moves toward a single conclusion. If there is to be any continuation of their family, it must come through their father. The text presents this reasoning plainly, without commentary, allowing the weight of it to rest fully on the reader. Their plan involves wine. In the ancient world, wine was common, but it was also understood as something that could dull awareness. The daughters decide to give their father wine so that he will not know what occurs. This detail is emphasized twice in the text. The lack of his awareness is not implied. It is stated directly. The narrative is careful to clarify that Lot does not perceive what is happening, neither when his daughter lies down nor when she rises. On the first night, the older daughter acts. She carries out the plan as it was spoken. The Bible records the event in a single, restrained sentence. There is no description of emotion, no internal thoughts, no elaboration. The act is stated, and then the narrative moves on. When morning comes, nothing is said. There is no reaction described. The story does not pause to explore guilt, relief, or fear. The next day, the older daughter speaks again. She tells her younger sister what has occurred. Her words are direct and factual. She explains the plan must be repeated so that both daughters may preserve offspring from their father. There is no hint of hesitation recorded. The younger daughter agrees. That same night, wine is given again. The younger daughter lies with her father. Again, the text emphasizes his lack of awareness. The repetition of the structure is striking. 2 nights, 2 actions, 2 conceptions. The symmetry reinforces the intentional nature of what takes place. This is not presented as a moment of chaos or loss of control. It is methodical, quiet, and contained within the narrow world of the cave. The Bible does not linger here. It does not dwell on the act beyond what is necessary to understand what happens. There is no attempt to soften it, but neither is there any attempt to dramatize it. The language remains spare. The restraint of the narrative itself becomes part of its meaning. What follows is simply stated. Both daughters conceive by their father. Time passes. Children are born. Names are given. The act itself concludes not with immediate consequence, but with the beginning of something new. The text moves forward without explanation, leaving interpretation behind rather than built into the telling. This manner of storytelling is intentional. By refusing to sensationalize, the biblical text resists turning the event into spectacle. It does not invite voyeurism or emotional manipulation. Instead, it places the reader in the uncomfortable position of having to sit with the facts as they are. There is no attempt to justify the daughters within the narrative voice. Their reasoning is recorded, but it is not endorsed. There is no divine instruction preceding the act, no prophetic word, no approval spoken afterward. The absence of commentary creates a space that feels almost heavy with restraint. The father's role is also presented with careful limitation. His actions are framed entirely by his lack of awareness. The text does not describe him as initiating, consenting, or even knowing. This does not resolve the moral weight of the situation, but it clarifies how the story the moment the facts settle, the reaction arrives almost uninvited. For many modern listeners, the first response is a tightening in the chest, a pause in the flow of listening, a quiet but firm sense that something here feels deeply wrong. The story does not ease us into that reaction. It places it directly in front of us and then remains silent, allowing the discomfort to speak for itself. Questions surface quickly. Why is this story here? Why is it told with such calm restraint? Why is there no immediate explanation that tells us how to feel? Modern readers are accustomed to moral framing. We expect clarity, commentary, and resolution. We are trained by storytelling to look for cues that separate right from wrong in unmistakable ways. This text refuses to do that, and the refusal itself becomes unsettling. There is also the shock of recognition that this story exists within Scripture at all. Many people approach the Bible expecting inspiration, guidance, and reassurance. Encountering a narrative that confronts taboo behavior so directly can feel disorienting. It challenges assumptions about what sacred texts contain and how they function. The immediate instinct may be to distance oneself from the passage, to label it as strange, outdated, or uncomfortable enough to avoid. The discomfort deepens when the text does not rush to defend itself. There is no narrator stepping in to explain motives in emotionally familiar terms. There is no divine voice interrupting the scene. The absence of explanation leaves the modern listener alone with the rawness of the account. That solitude mirrors, in a quiet way, the isolation within the story itself. Another reaction arises from the tension between empathy and judgment. Listeners may feel pulled in opposite directions. On one hand, there is awareness of trauma, fear, and loss. On the other, there is an unshakable sense that boundaries have been crossed. Holding both reactions at once can feel uncomfortable. Modern culture often pushes toward quick resolution. Either we condemn or we excuse. This story resists both impulses. There is also the question of silence. Why does the Bible not say more here? Why does it not spell out condemnation in clear terms? For readers accustomed to moral clarity, Silence can feel like ambiguity, and ambiguity can feel threatening. It raises anxiety about interpretation. If the text does not explain itself, then responsibility shifts to the reader, and that responsibility can feel heavy. Some listeners may feel a defensive reaction, an urge to protect the text by explaining it away quickly. Others may feel the opposite, an urge to reject the passage as incompatible with modern values. Both reactions are understandable. Both are attempts to escape the discomfort rather than remain with it. There is also the influence of contemporary awareness around trauma and consent. Modern readers bring knowledge and language that the ancient text does not use explicitly. This creates friction between present understanding and ancient narration. The story does not align neatly with modern categories, and that mismatch intensifies the sense of unease. For many, the gut reaction includes the question of fairness. Why are the daughters remembered primarily for this act? Why does the story not record their grief more fully? Why does it move so quickly from catastrophe to action without pause? These questions arise not from hostility, but from a desire to understand how human suffering is portrayed. The discomfort also exposes expectations we bring to Scripture. We often hope sacred texts will protect us from complexity rather than confront us with it. When a passage does the opposite, it can feel like a breach of trust. Yet that feeling may reveal more about our expectations than about the text itself. There is a quiet realization that this story cannot be consumed casually. It demands attention. It refuses to be background noise. Even when told in a calm voice, its content pulls the listener into alertness. The discomfort is not loud, but it is persistent. For some, the immediate reaction includes a desire to skip ahead, to move past this section toward something more familiar or comforting. This instinct is natural, yet the very urge to avoid the passage highlights its power. It exposes the places where faith, morality, and human behavior collide without easy resolution. The story also unsettles because it disrupts the idea that biblical figures always act as moral examples. Here, the characters are not models to imitate. They are human beings recorded honestly, without polish. This honesty can feel jarring, especially for those taught to read Scripture primarily as a collection of lessons rather than a record of lived experience. As the initial reaction settles, another awareness begins to form. The discomfort itself may be part of the purpose. The story does not seek to soothe immediately. It seeks to awaken attention. It invites the listener to slow down, to question assumptions, and to acknowledge that some truths are revealed not through comfort, but through unease. This segment of the narrative leaves the listener suspended in that space. No conclusions are offered yet. No moral summaries appear. Only the lingering awareness that something profound and troubling has been placed before us, asking not for quick answers, but for honest engagement. The unease that lingers begins to open into understanding when we consider the daughter's perspective more closely. From where they stand, the world is no longer a place of safety, structure, or predictability. Their father is aging. Their mother is gone. The cities they once knew have been obliterated, leaving behind only memory and ruin. In that stark landscape, survival is no longer abstract. It is an urgent, pressing reality. Every instinct in their minds is shaped by the perception of scarcity, absence, and threat. The notion of necessity becomes central to their thinking. In their eyes, preserving their family line is not merely a personal desire or a cultural expectation. It is a matter of life continuing beyond immediate extinction. Without children, their family would cease entirely. Their identity, their connection to ancestors, and their place in history would vanish. Within the framework of ancient Near Eastern society, to act otherwise would be to surrender not only themselves, but the lineage of their household to oblivion. This perception of necessity carries with it an intensity that can be difficult to grasp in modern terms. Today, survival is often secured through social networks, legal systems, and broader community structures. In the context of this story, those supports are gone. The daughters are isolated. The people they might have married are no longer accessible. They have no elders to advise them, no friends to confide in, no societal systems to guide or intervene. The calculus of survival narrows to what is immediately in front of them. When the older daughter observes their circumstances and speaks of the lack of men on the earth, she articulates a reasoning rooted entirely in their lived reality. It is not abstract philosophy. It is a direct assessment of what they perceive as the totality of their options. The younger daughter, hearing this, recognizes the same urgency. In agreeing to the plan, she does not express enthusiasm or malice, but a sober acknowledgement that inaction could mean the end of their family line. The plan itself is approached methodically. Wine is used to dull awareness. Timing is considered. Each step is deliberate and contained. From a modern perspective, it is jarring to imagine these decisions as methodical rather than impulsive, but in the daughter's perspective, planning ensures the maximum chance of what they see as a necessary outcome. The narrative presents this execution without embellishment, reinforcing the idea that the act is rooted in careful, if desperate, calculation. Understanding desperation in this context also requires considering the psychological state that accompanies isolation and fear. Trauma, grief, and uncertainty compress judgment. When the world has shifted so dramatically, the mind seeks pathways that promise continuity and survival, sometimes at the expense of conventional moral reasoning. For the daughters, the cave is both refuge and confinement. Every option is limited, and the decision they make is shaped by the immediate perception of lack rather than by a broader moral landscape. The historical context adds another layer of clarity. Women in their society had few avenues for securing their futures independently. Marriage and offspring were tightly bound to social security, family identity, and personal survival. Childlessness could result in marginalization or economic vulnerability. In this environment, the daughter's reasoning does not exist in a vacuum. It emerges from a societal framework where the continuity of lineage is a practical necessity, a duty intertwined with survival and honor. Moreover, their father's state is crucial to the calculus. Lot is aging, and his perceived fertility is limited. From the daughter's perspective, the opportunity to ensure offspring may exist only in the present moment. The temporal pressure is intense. Delay could mean impossibility. This urgency intensifies the perceived necessity of the actions they take, framing them not as acts of indulgence or desire, but as measures forced by circumstance. The narrative itself emphasizes the lack of alternatives without explicitly stating it. By situating the daughters in a cave, removed from society, with cities destroyed and resources minimal, the text communicates scarcity and isolation as key drivers of their choice. The reader begins to see that desperation is not a convenient excuse. It is the central condition of the story. This perspective does not erase the moral complexity. The act remains difficult, the choice is fraught, and the consequences far-reaching. But seeing the story through the daughter's eyes allows a recognition that extreme circumstances distort the options available. It invites empathy, not for the sake of excusing behavior, but for the sake of understanding the weight under which decisions are made. In considering the daughter's perception of necessity, we also confront the tension between agency and compulsion. They act voluntarily, yet their perception of volition is shaped by a world in collapse. Their freedom is circumscribed by fear, isolation, and cultural norms. In a modern lens, this may resemble situations where constrained circumstances force individuals into choices that would be unthinkable under ordinary conditions. Recognizing this tension deepens the understanding of both the narrative and the human condition it portrays. Within this labyrinth of ethics, the story does not offer judgment. It presents the facts, the reasoning, and the execution. It allows the reader to witness desperation as a powerful and shaping force. The cave, the isolation, the absent society, the awareness of mortality and lineage, all converge to frame the daughter's choices. What emerges is an ethically complex tableau where actions are inseparable from context, and where human ingenuity and moral ambiguity coexist in tension. Desperate measures, then, are not simply acts of transgression. In this narrative, they are acts of calculated necessity filtered through fear, duty, and cultural expectation. The story invites reflection on how extreme conditions can reshape moral reasoning, and how perceptions of necessity influence choices that reverberate far beyond the immediate moment. By examining the daughter's perspective in detail, we begin to see the story not as sensational or shocking for its own sake, but as a profound meditation on human survival under duress. The narrative challenges the listener to inhabit that perspective, to understand how desperation, cultural context, and isolation intersect, and to recognize the complexity inherent in human decision-making when the ordinary structures of society and support have vanished. This is where the ethical labyrinth becomes visible. The daughter's actions are neither easily excused nor neatly condemned. They are choices made within a narrow, constraining framework of fear, duty, and perception. The story compels the reader to hold that tension, to see the influence of circumstance on human action, and to resist the temptation to simplify what is inherently complex. The account does not pause to explain emotional states, moral certainty, or divine judgment. It leaves space for the reader to dwell in the uncomfortable but necessary engagement with human desperation. And it is within this engagement that the story's profound insight begins to emerge. That understanding human behavior requires attention to context, to perception, and to the pressures that shape decision-making when survival itself is at stake. The daughter's actions are thus an entry point into a broader reflection on ethics. They illuminate how circumstance, urgency, and cultural expectation can compress choice, how moral reasoning can operate differently under pressure, and how the narrative can record these realities without judgment. In this quiet presentation, the story teaches a form of ethical observation that is attentive, patient, and acutely aware of human fragility. By seeing the calculated necessity, the isolation, and the fear that underpin these acts, we are invited to hold complexity without rushing toward condemnation. The ethical labyrinth is not a puzzle to solve quickly. It is a space to inhabit with attention and reflection. Here, the daughter's perspective provides both context and insight, showing how extreme circumstances push the boundaries of decision-making and force us to grapple with the profound tensions between survival, duty, and morality. In order to truly understand the choices the daughters made, it helps to step fully into the cultural landscape in which they lived. Ancient Near Eastern society was structured around lineage, family continuity, and the preservation of household identity. The social framework was built in such a way that individuals were rarely isolated units. They existed primarily in connection with their families, their clans, and their communities. Every action carried implications not only for personal survival, but for the survival of the family name and the household's standing in society. Women, in particular, had their roles tightly defined within this framework. Their social status, security, and future were intertwined with marriage and childbearing. In a world where women could rarely secure independent livelihoods, producing offspring was a form of protection. It was not only a matter of personal fulfillment or desire, but a tangible means to ensure that a family line persisted and that they themselves were tied into the social and economic fabric of their world. Without children, a woman risked marginalization, poverty, or complete invisibility in historical memory. Lineage was more than just a genealogical concern. It was the thread that connected generations, that tied the present to ancestors, that legitimized claims to land, wealth, and position. Inheritance flowed through sons, and family honor was measured in part by the continuation of the bloodline. The daughters of Lot would have been acutely aware that, without heirs, their father's household would vanish from memory. In their perception, allowing that to happen would have been equivalent to allowing history itself to forget them. The collapse of Sodom and Gomorrah also magnified this concern. The destruction of the cities removed any potential for social integration, marriage prospects, or alliances that might have been available in ordinary circumstances. The daughter's world was not merely small, it was perceived as nearly empty. The cultural expectation that a family must survive and continue now intersected with the immediate reality that no men were accessible, and that their father was the last available conduit for life to continue. Their actions, uncomfortable as they are to modern sensibilities, were shaped by the norms and pressures of their environment. Understanding the daughter's behavior requires seeing the weight of cultural duty pressing on them. Ancient Near Eastern norms placed the continuation of the family line above many personal considerations. In times of crisis, these norms could dictate extraordinary measures. A woman's primary identity was often bound to her reproductive role, and the failure to fulfill this role could carry profound social consequences, including loss of security, status, and purpose. The daughter's perception of obligation was, therefore, deeply embedded in the structure of their society, not merely in personal inclination. It is also important to note that in this cultural context, the preservation of lineage was a moral and social imperative. The daughter's actions were framed not only as pragmatic, but as fulfilling a recognized duty. The narrative itself does not explicitly endorse this interpretation, yet by situating the events within the norms of the society, modern readers can begin to see why the daughters perceived their plan as necessary and even responsible within their worldview. Another aspect of this cultural lens is the understanding of male authority and family structure. Lot, as the father and head of the household, held a central role in maintaining the family line. The daughter's plan did not challenge the patriarchal order, but instead sought to operate through it, using his position as the conduit for continuity. This is an uncomfortable truth to recognize, yet it illustrates the pervasive influence of societal norms on behavior and decision-making. The daughters acted within the only framework they understood, aligning themselves with the structure of authority and lineage, even in a situation that, by modern standards, feels morally ambiguous. Survival in this society was often inseparable from family continuity. When the daughters viewed their options, they likely measured risk not only in terms of immediate physical safety, but in terms of historical and social erasure. In a society that relied heavily on family lines to transmit property, honor, and religious observance, failing to act could mean the disappearance of not only their own future, but also that of the broader household. Cultural expectation and practical survival merged into a singular, pressing concern. The story also shows that extreme circumstances amplify cultural pressures. In ordinary times, young women might have sought husbands, relatives, or alliances to ensure continuity. After the destruction of Sodom and the isolation in the hills, the normal social pathways were gone. Cultural norms did not vanish, but the means to fulfill them were restricted. In this vacuum, the daughters acted decisively within the parameters that remained available to them. By examining these ancient norms, we can see that the daughters' choices were not made lightly. They were operating under the combined weight of trauma, isolation, cultural expectation, and existential urgency. The ethical discomfort modern readers feel is real, but understanding the societal framework allows us to see why such desperate measures appeared to them not only necessary but morally comprehensible within their world. This cultural perspective also helps explain the quiet restraint of the biblical narration. The text does not provide moral commentary because it assumes, in a way that modern readers do not, that its audience understands the cultural imperatives at play. For contemporary listeners, unpacking these norms provides insight into why the story was preserved, why it was recounted plainly, and why it leaves moral interpretation largely in the hands of the audience rather than stated directly by the narrator. The weight of lineage, the societal role of women, the primacy of family continuity, and the urgency of survival converge to frame the daughter's reasoning. In viewing the narrative through this lens, it becomes possible to perceive their actions not merely as shocking transgression, but as a product of a deeply conditioned understanding of duty, necessity, and the social imperatives that structured life in their world. Through this lens, modern listeners can begin to hold multiple truths at once. The daughters acted in ways that make us uncomfortable, yet their actions were shaped by an environment in which survival and family continuity were inseparable. The narrative preserves the act without embellishment, allowing the audience to wrestle with the tension between ethical discomfort and cultural understanding. The cave becomes a microcosm of a society where lineage, survival, and gender roles intersect with history, trauma, and isolation. Every choice is measured against the demands of culture and the imperatives of survival. The daughter's plan is neither impulsive nor reckless. It is carefully calculated, informed by norms that prioritize family continuity and recognize the dangers of female marginalization in a society that leaves little room for alternative futures. By considering the cultural context in such detail, listeners can approach the story with a depth of comprehension that is impossible without stepping into the daughter's world. The actions that initially appear incomprehensible are revealed to be situated within an intricate matrix of social expectation, familial responsibility, and perceived necessity. Understanding the cultural lens does not erase moral questions, but it illuminates why those questions are complex, why judgment is not straightforward, and why the story continues to provoke reflection thousands of years later. The daughter's decisions, seen through this lens, carry weight not only for their immediate situation but for the generations that follow. Their acts set the stage for descendants, tribes, and nations, all of which are tied to lineage, social recognition, and continuity. The cultural norms of their time provide the context in which such acts could be perceived as both desperate and duty-bound, situating the narrative within a coherent, though challenging, historical, and social framework. In this quiet understanding, the story gains depth. It is not merely a tale of moral failure or shocking action. It is a narrative rooted in cultural reality, historical necessity, and the pressures of a society where survival, continuity, and the role of women in family lineage were intimately entwined. The text presents these facts without embellishment, leaving modern listeners to contemplate the intersection of human behavior, social expectation, and ethical complexity in a world that was vastly different from our own, yet shaped by struggles that remain profoundly human. One of the most striking features of this narrative is the quiet absence of divine commentary. The Bible often provides explicit instruction, blessing, or judgment, yet here there is a notable silence. There is no recorded word from God, no angelic intervention, no pronouncement of approval or condemnation. This absence can feel disconcerting, especially in contrast to other moments in Scripture where divine guidance or reprimand is unmistakable. This silence invites reflection. It is as if the narrative trusts the reader to sit with the events and wrestle with their meaning without leaning on divine affirmation or disapproval. The daughters act, the father remains unaware, children are born, and the story continues. There is no supernatural commentary to frame the ethical or spiritual weight of the situation. The text presents the facts with restraint, leaving interpretation largely to the audience. One possible implication is that the story emphasizes human agency within a framework of necessity and cultural expectation. By not explicitly condemning or endorsing the act, the text highlights the gravity of choices made in desperation. The absence of divine voice may signal that the moral complexity is meant to be observed rather than simplified, that human decision-making often exists in spaces where guidance is ambiguous or absent. The theological silence also draws attention to the narrative's broader concerns. The text does not focus on sin or punishment in this moment, but on lineage and historical consequence. The daughter's actions have implications that extend through generations, yet the immediate spiritual judgment is left unspoken. This may suggest that the biblical authors were more interested in recording the continuity of families and nations than providing direct moral commentary on every act, allowing readers across time to wrestle with ambiguity. For modern readers, the silence can feel unsettling because it removes a familiar anchor. When we encounter difficult or troubling actions in Scripture, we often look for divine voice to guide understanding. In its absence, the story demands engagement. It asks listeners to hold discomfort, to observe actions without immediate reassurance, and to grapple with complexity without the comfort of a clear moral verdict. The silence also leaves room for reflection on the nature of divine judgment. The text does not describe punishment, retribution, or blessing, and this absence can suggest that moral evaluation is not always immediate, observable, or conventional. It raises questions about how God interacts with human choice, the role of free will, and the ways in which human history unfolds in the presence of divine providence. This absence may also be deliberate in drawing attention to the narrative's human dimensions. By refraining from inserting judgment, the story highlights the practical, cultural, and emotional factors that shape behavior. Listeners are invited to consider the daughter's perspective, the collapse of their society, the isolation and fear, and the weight of familial duty. The theological silence thus functions as a narrative strategy, allowing the human elements to resonate without interference. The restraint in moral commentary also encourages deep listening. It forces the audience to confront their own ethical assumptions, to wrestle with feelings of discomfort, judgment, or empathy. In doing so, The story becomes a mirror, reflecting modern sensibilities back to us while rooted firmly in its ancient context. The absence of divine voice amplifies the need for introspection and critical engagement. It is also worth noting that while the text is silent about immediate divine reaction, the broader biblical narrative later acknowledges the offspring of these actions. The Moabites and Ammonites, descended from the daughters, are recorded in later histories and genealogies. This continuity may imply a quiet divine allowance for history to unfold, leaving the consequences to play out in the social and political realities of subsequent generations, rather than intervening directly in the moral dimension of the act itself. Theological silence in this story challenges assumptions about how God's presence is manifest in Scripture. It is different from narratives in which divine judgment is swift and obvious. Instead, it suggests that some human experiences are recorded in their raw form, allowing readers to observe and reflect rather than rely on authoritative interpretation. The absence itself becomes a teaching point, inviting meditation on the complexities of divine interaction, human agency, and moral ambiguity. For listeners, this silence offers both a challenge and an opportunity. The challenge lies in resisting the urge for simple answers or immediate judgment. The opportunity lies in cultivating a capacity to hold uncertainty, to explore motivations, cultural context, and the weight of circumstance in evaluating human behavior. By confronting a narrative that refuses to simplify, the audience practices a form of spiritual and ethical engagement that is patient, thoughtful, and nuanced. The narrative's quietude also emphasizes continuity over immediate moral reckoning. The daughter's actions are recorded as part of a chain of events that shape the future, but the text does not pause to pronounce judgment. In doing so, it shifts focus from immediate ethical evaluation to long-term consequence, history, and the unfolding of human and familial trajectories. The story thus models a form of observation that is concerned with outcomes and human experience as much as moral instruction. Through this, by leaving divine judgment unspoken, the text invites the audience to practice discernment, empathy, and patience. It calls for attentiveness to human motivation, cultural pressures, and historical context. It highlights that moral clarity is not always immediate, that the consequences of actions may be visible only through the lens of history, and that ethical engagement requires thoughtful attention rather than reflexive response. In this silence, the story becomes both a narrative and a mirror, presenting events with precision and restraint while compelling readers and listeners to examine their own assumptions, judgments, and capacity for empathy. The quiet absence of divine commentary transforms the account into a space where complexity is honored, reflection is encouraged, and understanding is cultivated through patient observation rather than prescriptive instruction. The narrative's silence is, in itself, a profound lesson. It demonstrates that Scripture sometimes records human experience without immediate interpretation, leaving moral, ethical, and spiritual questions open for engagement. It emphasizes that understanding human behavior requires careful attention to context, culture, and circumstance, and that reflection is a vital part of engaging with stories that challenge, disturb, and provoke thought. In the absence of explicit divine commentary, the story compels the audience to listen closely, to weigh human motivations, and to explore the consequences of choices shaped by desperation, culture, and isolation. It invites the listener into a contemplative space where ambiguity is not avoided, where discomfort becomes a tool for understanding, and where theological reflection is exercised not by external judgment, but by careful attention to the unfolding of human experience. The silence is not empty. It resonates with the weight of ethical complexity, the nuances of cultural context, and the reality of human frailty. It allows the story to speak with a quiet authority, inviting reflection on the interplay of necessity, agency, and morality, and encouraging a depth of engagement that remains with the listener long after the words themselves have been spoken. From the moment the daughters carried out their plan, the effects of their actions extended far beyond the immediate cave in which they took place. The narrative does not linger on judgment or moral evaluation, yet it carefully records the outcome: the birth of children who would become the ancestors of entire nations. The eldest daughter bore a son named Moab, who became the progenitor of the Moabites. The younger daughter bore a son named Ben-Ammi, from whom the Ammonites descended. These descendants would shape the social, political, and cultural landscape of the region for generations, establishing tribes that later interacted, often contentiously, with Israel. Tracing this lineage reveals how individual human choices ripple outward in ways that are unforeseen and long-lasting. The daughter's actions, born of desperation and a sense of duty, created the foundation for peoples who would exist alongside and sometimes in opposition to the descendants of Abraham. Moabites and Ammonites appear repeatedly in the biblical record, engaged in commerce, war, and diplomacy with the Israelites. Their presence in the narrative underscores how a single episode of necessity and survival can shape the broader history of nations. The Moabites, for example, established themselves in the highlands east of the Dead Sea. They became a distinct people with their own cultural and religious practices. The Ammonites similarly settled in territory that would later be known as Ammon, northeast of the Dead Sea. These populations were not isolated anomalies. They were part of the unfolding story of the ancient Near East, interacting with neighbors, influencing trade routes, engaging in conflicts, and contributing to the historical and spiritual milieu in which the Israelites would emerge as a nation. From a biblical perspective, the story illustrates that actions, even those undertaken under duress and within a constrained ethical framework, carry consequences that echo across time. The daughters likely could not have imagined the far-reaching implications of their choice. Yet through their immediate necessity, they became central to the formation of peoples whose interactions with Israel would be recorded in history and scripture. Their private, desperate act was thus interwoven with the destiny of entire nations, showing how human decisions, even morally complex or troubling ones, contribute to the unfolding tapestry of history. The narrative does not frame this as punishment or reward, but simply as fact. The genealogical record is presented matter-of-factly: Moab, Ben-Ammi, descendants, nations. This presentation reinforces the idea that human actions have material and historical consequences that extend beyond the immediacy of the actor's experience. It is a reminder that choices made in moments of desperation can influence the political, social, and cultural realities of the future. This long-term perspective also invites reflection on how history is shaped by necessity and survival rather than moral perfection. The daughters acted according to what they perceived as necessary within their cultural and social context. Their actions were fraught with ethical ambiguity, yet they produced tangible outcomes that contributed to the historical landscape. The text allows us to see that the consequences of human behavior are often complex and multidimensional, affecting both immediate circumstances and generations to come. The emergence of the Moabites and Ammonites also illustrates the intersection of human agency and divine providence. The narrative leaves divine judgment silent, yet the unfolding history shows that these nations existed within the broader plan and promise given to Abraham and his descendants. The story does not resolve ethical questions or provide clear moral conclusions, but it demonstrates that human decisions, even those made under constraint, are part of a larger historical and spiritual framework. This ripple effect highlights another key point. Ethical and practical decisions are rarely contained. What may appear as a small, private, or desperate measure can have repercussions that shape societies, affect future generations, and influence interactions between peoples and nations. The daughters could not have foreseen the future geopolitical, social, or cultural realities that would emerge from their actions, yet the biblical record preserves their legacy in a way that underscores the interconnectedness of human history. Understanding this ripple effect encourages a nuanced reading of Scripture. It reminds us that biblical narratives often include morally complex situations without immediate resolution or judgment. By tracing consequences over generations, we can appreciate the depth and breadth of human agency, the ways that survival and cultural imperatives shape decisions, and the reality that human actions contribute to historical outcomes far beyond the individuals directly involved. The story of Lot's daughters thus becomes more than a moment of shocking narrative. It serves as a case study in the intergenerational consequences of human action, in the way that private, desperate choices can resonate through time, and in the complex interplay between necessity, culture, and historical development. The genealogical thread from the cave to nations, such as Moab and Ammon, demonstrates how a single event, recorded quietly and without overt judgment, can shape the social and political landscape for centuries. In observing this long-term outcome, modern readers are challenged to hold multiple layers of understanding simultaneously. One can acknowledge the discomfort and ethical ambiguity of the act, while also recognizing the historical reality of its consequences. The story invites reflection on how human behavior, even when morally difficult, interacts with broader forces of history and culture, and how actions taken in the most constrained circumstances can leave a lasting imprint on the world. The lineage of Moab and Ben-Ammi shows that consequences are not always immediate or contained. What begins as an act of survival in a cave becomes the foundation for nations, peoples, and historical narratives. This realization emphasizes the interconnectedness of human actions and the enduring significance of decisions made in moments of crisis, demonstrating that the long-term effects of even private and morally complex choices are often far greater than the actors themselves could imagine. Through this lens, the story moves beyond simple condemnation or judgment. It presents a narrative of cause and effect, showing that human decisions are woven into the ongoing fabric of history. The biblical record captures the emergence of peoples and nations as a consequence of actions taken under desperate conditions, allowing readers to see how human agency, cultural norms, and historical forces converge in ways that shape the destiny of generations. By tracing this lineage, the narrative encourages listeners to reflect on the complexity of cause and effect, on the ways that personal choices intersect with history, and on the reality that even morally ambiguous actions can have significant and lasting influence. The daughter's story is thus both intensely human and profoundly historical, illustrating the interconnectedness of survival, culture, and consequence, and offering a lens through which to view the ongoing ripple effects of human behavior in the tapestry of biblical history. The story of Lot's daughters defies the comfort of clear moral binaries. It does not present a simple contrast between right and wrong, good and evil, virtue and sin. There is no character within this narrative who is entirely admirable or entirely blameworthy in the ways we often expect from modern storytelling. The daughter's actions, Lot's presence, and the unfolding consequences all exist within a web of human complexity that resists easy categorization. This is a story that challenges the listener to sit with ambiguity and to wrestle with a tension between ethical discomfort and historical reality. The narrative places the audience in a position of observation rather than judgment. We are asked to witness an act born of desperation, to understand the cultural and social pressures that shaped it, and to see the long-term outcomes that followed. There is no divine voice instructing us on what to think, no narrator offering reassurance, no explicit moral evaluation. The absence of these guiding elements is deliberate, inviting reflection rather than dictating interpretation. One reason the story resists simple answers is that every character is operating under intense constraints. The daughters face isolation, trauma, and the collapse of their familiar world. Their choices are shaped not only by survival instincts, but by deeply ingrained cultural norms regarding lineage, family duty, and the role of women. Lot, as the father, is unaware and largely passive, yet his presence is central to the unfolding events. Each person's agency is real, yet bounded, illustrating the tension between intention and circumstance. From a modern perspective, the ethical discomfort is immediate. The act of getting a father drunk to conceive children raises questions of consent, morality, and propriety. It provokes visceral reactions that make many readers or listeners recoil. Yet the story refuses to simplify these reactions into a binary judgment. The biblical text records the actions plainly, without embellishment or moralizing language. This neutrality encourages a deeper engagement with complexity, emphasizing that human decisions often exist in morally gray areas where context, necessity, and social structures profoundly influence behavior. Another layer of complexity arises when considering the long-term consequences. The children born from this act became ancestors of nations, shaping the history and politics of the region for generations. In some narratives, these descendants appear in conflict with Israel. In others, they participate in trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange. The narrative demonstrates that morally ambiguous actions can have wide-reaching and unpredictable effects, further complicating any simplistic labeling of right and wrong. The story also challenges assumptions about divine oversight and intervention. There is no explicit condemnation, yet the consequences of human behavior are visible in the genealogical and historical record. This lack of immediate moral adjudication reflects a worldview in which human history is shaped by the interplay of free will, cultural imperatives, and the unfolding of time, rather than by constant, visible divine interference. It is a reminder that the outcomes of our actions are often complex, layered, and beyond immediate moral clarity. Sitting with ambiguity in this story can be uncomfortable, but it is also instructive. It allows us to explore the tension between ethical principles and real-world necessity. It challenges us to consider the ways that context shapes decision-making and the limitations of applying modern moral frameworks to ancient circumstances. The narrative demonstrates that life, even as recorded in Scripture, is rarely neat, predictable, or morally straightforward. One way to approach this ambiguity is through empathy, without condoning or excusing. Recognizing the daughter's fear, isolation, and sense of duty helps illuminate why they acted as they did. It does not remove the ethical questions, but it situates them within a human experience that is understandable, if unsettling. By holding both discomfort and understanding simultaneously, the audience can engage more fully with the text and reflect on the ways that extreme circumstances can challenge conventional morality. The The story also invites reflection on the limits of human judgment. Engaging with the story of Lot's daughters can be unsettling. It presents situations that clash sharply with modern sensibilities, and the initial reactions of discomfort, disbelief, or moral questioning are entirely natural. Yet it is precisely this discomfort that offers an opportunity for deeper reflection. By confronting a narrative that challenges our ethical intuitions, we refine not only our understanding of the text itself, but also our insight into human desperation, cultural constraints, and the complexities of survival in extreme circumstances. One of the first lessons in approaching this discomfort is the recognition that human behavior in crisis often defies conventional moral frameworks. The daughters' actions cannot be fully understood without situating them in the context of their isolation, their trauma, and the collapse of the social world around them. The city of Sodom, which had been their home, was destroyed, leaving them in a cave with no family, no prospects, and a pressing fear that their family line could end. This was not a situation of leisurely decision-making, but one of urgent survival intertwined with social expectation. Recognizing the intensity of their circumstances helps the modern reader begin to see the human reality beneath the shocking act, and it forces the audience to grapple with moral ambiguity in a measured way. Confronting discomfort in this narrative also involves examining how biblical storytelling presents human action without glossing over its consequences. The text records what happened. The daughters carried out their plan, Lot remained unaware, and children were born. There is no moralizing commentary inserted by the narrator, yet the consequences are evident and profound. In this way, the story models an approach to Scripture that prioritizes observation and reflection over immediate judgment. By learning to hold the narrative in its full tension, listeners cultivate the ability to engage thoughtfully with ethically challenging texts, recognizing that discomfort is part of a deeper understanding rather than an obstacle to it. Furthermore, the story invites reflection on the motivations behind human decisions under duress. The daughters' actions were shaped by cultural imperatives regarding lineage and family continuity. In their context, ensuring the survival of their father's line was of utmost importance, and the narrative allows the audience to perceive this pressure without simplifying it into a moral directive. Engaging with these motivations teaches us that ethical behavior cannot always be evaluated in abstraction from circumstance. Human choices are rarely made in isolation, and understanding the pressures and constraints that shape decision-making provides a richer, more nuanced comprehension of human behavior. This process of grappling with discomfort also illuminates broader patterns in biblical narrative. Scripture frequently presents morally complex situations, from the questionable decisions of kings to the desperate acts of ordinary people. By studying these moments without seeking immediate answers, readers develop a capacity to navigate the moral and historical complexity of the Bible. The story of Lot's daughters, while extreme in its circumstances, is part of this broader pattern. It reminds us that human behavior, societal norms, and divine providence interact in ways that are not always immediately comprehensible or easily categorized. Learning from discomfort also involves recognizing the emotional and psychological dimensions of the narrative. The daughters were living in isolation, fearful, and mourning the loss of their community. Their plan, though shocking to modern sensibilities, emerged from a space of profound vulnerability and a sense of urgent responsibility. Contemplating the human psychology at play encourages empathy and provides insight into how extreme circumstances can distort conventional reasoning and ethical decision-making. By engaging with these elements, listeners develop a deeper understanding of human nature and the forces that drive behavior under pressure. The discomfort generated by the story also functions as a lens for self-reflection. When encountering actions that challenge moral intuition, audiences are prompted to consider their own values, assumptions, and responses to ethical ambiguity. By reflecting on why the narrative provokes shock, judgment, or confusion, listeners gain insight into the frameworks through which they interpret human behavior. This process transforms discomfort into an educational and reflective tool, turning initial unease into an opportunity for spiritual and ethical growth. Additionally, the story illustrates how desperation can shape actions that have long-lasting effects. The daughter's choices, while made in a brief and intense period, initiated a lineage that contributed to the formation of nations. Observing this chain of consequences encourages an appreciation of the long-term implications of human decisions. It teaches that choices made in moments of extremity are not isolated. They ripple outward in ways that can influence society, culture, and history. By examining these outcomes, the audience can learn to approach both scripture and real-world ethical dilemmas with greater awareness of context, causality, and consequence. Confronting discomfort also deepens the listener's capacity for interpretive patience. The narrative does not resolve the tension it presents. It leaves questions unanswered, motivations complex, and morality ambiguous. Engaging with this open-endedness requires holding multiple perspectives simultaneously, understanding desperation, recognizing cultural imperatives, observing consequences, and wrestling with ethical unease. This patient engagement strengthens the ability to approach Scripture, and indeed any difficult text, with thoughtfulness, humility, and reflective curiosity. Another important aspect of learning from discomfort lies in acknowledging the limits of contemporary moral frameworks when applied to ancient contexts. Modern readers are equipped with ethical norms shaped by current social, legal, and cultural understandings. The world of Lot's daughters operated under a different set of imperatives and expectations, particularly regarding lineage, survival, and the obligations of women to their family line. Recognizing these differences does not excuse or justify their actions, but it enables a more accurate and empathetic understanding of their decisions within the framework of their historical reality. The narrative also teaches that moral evaluation is not always the primary purpose of biblical storytelling. In many cases, including this one, the focus is on historical consequence, lineage, and the unfolding of human events under divine providence. Observing this prioritization can refine the audience's approach to Scripture, helping listeners to differentiate between narrative emphasis and moral instruction. Learning from discomfort, then, is not solely about reconciling. In considering the story of Lot's daughters through the lens of empathy, it becomes possible to approach their actions not merely as shocking events to be judged, but as responses to an overwhelming and traumatic reality. They had lived through the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, cities that had once been their home, now reduced to ruin and fire. The chaos, fear, and loss they experienced were immense, shaping every decision they made thereafter. They were young women suddenly isolated from their familiar social world, forced to navigate a landscape that had shifted from security to uncertainty overnight. Trauma in this context is not a minor detail. It is a defining force that informs their perceptions, their fears, and the urgency behind their choices. Being empathetic toward the daughters requires understanding that they were living in a world that had been literally turned upside down. Their father, Lot, was their closest family, yet they were separated from any broader support system, entirely dependent on him for survival. Isolation magnifies vulnerability, and the cave where they took refuge, though providing shelter from the elements, was a small and confined space that underscored their solitude. In this vacuum of community and security, they had to make decisions that we might struggle to fully comprehend today. Part of the daughter's sense of duty was entwined with deeply ingrained cultural norms. In the ancient Near East, family continuity and the preservation of lineage were paramount, especially in situations where the patriarch of a household remained, but the broader family network had been decimated. The daughters perceived that ensuring their father's lineage was not simply a personal concern. It was a responsibility embedded in their understanding of honor, obligation, and social order. Their perception of duty was therefore a complex mix of personal loyalty, social expectation, and a desire to secure some measure of stability in a world that had been violently destabilized. Empathy also invites attention to the psychological burden they bore. Beyond isolation and societal expectation, there was the constant presence of danger, uncertainty, and grief. The destruction of Sodom was not only a physical catastrophe, but a profound psychological one, erasing familiar landscapes, structures, and social networks. The daughters' fear of obliteration, both of their family line and of their own existence, was ever present. Their actions, however troubling from a modern standpoint, can be understood as emerging from this confluence of grief, fear, and responsibility. It is not justification but contextualization, offering a window into how human beings respond under extreme duress. Understanding their perspective also requires consideration of the moral and existential pressures they faced. In their world, opportunities for survival, security, and the continuation of family were tightly constrained. Unlike modern societies, which provide legal, social, and institutional mechanisms to support individuals, these women had very limited options. The cave in which they hid was their immediate world, and every decision had to be made within its boundaries. In that confined space, they confronted the terrifying prospect that their family line could end if they did nothing. It is within this narrow corridor of survival that their plan unfolded. Empathy extends to recognizing the inner conflict that must have accompanied their actions. The biblical text does not provide direct insight into their private reflections, but it is reasonable to imagine that moments of doubt, fear, and hesitation accompanied their resolve. Trauma often generates a mixture of instinct, emotion, and rationalization, and these young women were likely navigating all three. Their decision to act was not a carefree or casual choice. It was a measured response to a complex and threatening environment. Additionally, viewing their actions through empathy allows for the acknowledgement of courage, albeit within a morally fraught context. They acted decisively in a situation that was terrifying, uncertain, and morally ambiguous. Courage in the face of despair does not automatically confer moral approval, but it does illuminate the human capacity to act even when options are constrained and stakes are high. Their bravery was entwined with fear, grief, and duty, highlighting the multidimensionality of human decision-making in extreme circumstances. The story also underscores the interplay between isolation and moral reasoning. Removed from the broader societal structures and community support that often guide ethical behavior, the daughters had to rely on their own judgment and understanding of duty. In such isolation, the usual checks, balances, and moral discourse of community life are absent, and decisions are intensified by the pressure of immediate consequences. Empathizing with this reality helps modern listeners appreciate the extraordinary difficulty of ethical decision-making under extreme isolation. Empathy further encourages consideration of the daughter's ongoing emotional experience. The aftermath of their actions would have included both relief and likely lingering anxiety. They succeeded in fulfilling what they perceived as their duty to ensure the survival of Lot's lineage, yet the moral complexity and secrecy of their act would have weighed heavily. By recognizing the psychological and emotional dimensions of their experience, the story transforms from a distant or shocking historical anecdote into a profound exploration of human vulnerability, fear, and responsibility. Finally, approaching the narrative with gentle understanding fosters a deeper appreciation for the humanity. By empathizing with the daughter's trauma, isolation, and sense of duty, listeners can encounter the raw, often uncomfortable realities of human existence that the biblical narrative preserves. This empathetic engagement allows the story to function not only as a historical account, but also as a vehicle for exploring the resilience, complexity, and moral depth of human beings navigating desperate circumstances. Through this lens, the daughters are neither simplified into moral exemplars nor condemned solely for their choices. They are presented as fully human, experiencing fear, grief, responsibility, and courage in a world stripped of security. Gentle understanding does not eliminate ethical tension. It enriches it by situating the actions within lived experience, making the story not only intelligible but deeply instructive about the ways people respond to despair, the weight of perceived duty, and the enduring strength of human resolve even in the darkest moments. In recognizing the daughter's trauma, isolation, and perceived responsibility, the audience is invited to approach the narrative with patience, reflection, and compassion. It demonstrates that Scripture often presents human beings in their full complexity, and that understanding their actions requires attention to context, emotion, and cultural norms. This empathetic engagement transforms discomfort into insight, allowing listeners to appreciate the profound humanity embedded in even the most morally challenging stories of the biblical text. The story of Lot's daughters, when considered in the broader context of human experience, speaks powerfully to the universal themes of survival, fear, and the extraordinary lengths people will go to when stripped of security, support, and certainty. It is not merely a story of individuals in a particular historical moment. It is a reflection of the human condition itself, revealing how desperation and the instinct to endure can drive decisions that defy conventional morality. At its core, the narrative is about people responding to extreme circumstances, and it invites us to see in these responses a mirror of our own vulnerabilities, anxieties, and capacities for action when faced with the unknown. Survival is a primal, pervasive force in human life, and the daughters' actions illustrate the intensity of this drive. They had witnessed the annihilation of Sodom and Gomorrah, and the experience of fleeing into the wilderness was not a minor inconvenience, but a life-altering trauma. Their survival was contingent upon securing shelter, maintaining their father's lineage, and navigating a world suddenly devoid of social structure and familiar supports. In this sense, their choices were inseparable from the instinct to survive, demonstrating how basic human needs can compel actions that would otherwise seem unimaginable or morally ambiguous. Survival in extremis often compresses the moral and social frameworks through which ordinary decisions are normally filtered, and the daughter's story exemplifies this compression vividly. Fear is another central aspect of the human condition that this narrative exposes. The daughters lived in constant awareness of danger, isolation, and uncertainty. The destruction of Sodom was not a distant event. It was a lived catastrophe that reshaped every aspect of their reality. This fear was multi-layered. Fear for their own lives, fear for the continuity of their family line, and fear of a world that had become unpredictable and hostile. Such profound fear has a way of narrowing perception and focusing attention on immediate necessity rather than long-term ethical reflection. It teaches that human decision-making is deeply influenced by emotional states, particularly when survival is at stake, and reminds modern audiences that fear, though often uncomfortable or morally disruptive, is an essential part of the human experience. The lengths to which people go when stripped of everything are powerfully demonstrated in this account. The daughters' plan to ensure their father's lineage is shocking, yet it reflects a broader truth about human resilience and adaptability. In extreme circumstances, conventional morality may be suspended or reframed, not out of malice, but as a response to existential threats. Their actions illuminate the creative, albeit morally complex, strategies humans develop to navigate situations of extreme deprivation. The biblical narrative preserves these actions without embellishment, offering a raw and honest portrayal of survival instincts interacting with cultural imperatives and ethical ambiguity. This story also illustrates how isolation amplifies the intensity of human behavior. Removed from community oversight, support networks, and societal guidance, the daughters had to make decisions in a vacuum of social norms. Isolation often magnifies vulnerability, heightens anxiety, and necessitates self-reliance. The human condition, in this sense, includes both the physical and psychological dimensions of being cut off from familiar structures. The narrative invites reflection on how extreme isolation can push ordinary people to extraordinary actions, revealing both the fragility and the resilience inherent in humanity. Another universal theme evident in this story is the interplay between agency and constraint. The daughters acted decisively, yet their agency was shaped by circumstances beyond their control: the destruction of their city, the loss of community, and the perceived threat to their family line. Human action is often a negotiation between what is possible and what is necessary, and this story illustrates that negotiation with stark clarity. People are not infinitely free. Their choices are bounded by context, environment, and the urgent demands of survival. Recognizing this helps the audience understand that morally complex decisions are not merely personal failings, but often responses to structural, social, and existential pressures. The narrative also demonstrates how desperation can shape creativity and problem-solving. The daughters' approach was unconventional and morally challenging, yet it reflects the human capacity to devise solutions under extreme pressure. Human beings, when confronted with life-threatening or radically destabilizing circumstances, often develop strategies that would seem impossible or unacceptable in calmer times. This aspect of the human condition speaks to the adaptive nature of people. Resilience, ingenuity, and determination are often strongest when the stakes are highest. Fear, survival, and desperate action are themes that extend beyond this specific biblical narrative. Across history and across cultures, humans have repeatedly faced situations in which conventional moral structures are suspended by the immediacy of threat. Stories of famine, exile, war, and disaster all reveal that when basic needs are imperiled, ethical reasoning is entwined with survival instincts. The daughter's story thus functions as both a specific historical account and a timeless exploration of how people navigate extreme conditions, emphasizing that the challenges they faced are not unique but reflect enduring aspects of human life. The story also highlights the tension between instinct and reflection. The daughters acted in a moment of fear and urgency, responding to the pressures of survival and duty. Yet the narrative encourages modern readers to step back, reflect, and consider the broader implications of such actions. This duality, acting under compulsion while remaining aware of the extremes of circumstance, magnify human qualities, revealing both the admirable and troubling dimensions of survival-driven behavior. Finally, reflecting on the daughter's story in the context of the human condition encourages modern audiences to consider how they themselves might respond under similar pressures. While the specific circumstances of the biblical narrative are extraordinary, The underlying dynamics, fear, isolation, desperation, and responsibility, are recognizable across time and culture. By observing how the daughters navigated these dynamics, listeners gain insight into the resilience, adaptability, and complexity of human behavior, and they are invited to contemplate the ways in which survival instincts intersect with ethical, social, and emotional dimensions in their own lives. The narrative thus functions as both a historical account and a mirror of enduring human realities. It captures the tension between necessity and morality, the intensity of fear and trauma, and the extraordinary lengths to which people will go when stripped of security and certainty. By engaging with these universal themes, the audience can cultivate a deeper understanding of the human condition, appreciating the profound complexity of human behavior and the moral, psychological, and cultural forces that shape it. The daughter's story, while extreme, resonates as a timeless reflection of the resilience, vulnerability, and adaptability that define human life across all ages. The story of Lot's daughters invites more than historical or ethical analysis. It encourages a deep and personal reflection on morality, circumstance, and the nature of divine judgment. After witnessing the extremes of fear, desperation, and human vulnerability, it becomes apparent that the narrative is not merely an account to be observed, but a mirror in which listeners can examine their own values, judgments, and responses to difficult situations. By holding this story in mind, one is prompted to consider how morality interacts with circumstance, how human decisions are constrained by context, and how divine oversight operates in ways that are not always immediately apparent or comprehensible. Personal reflection begins with questioning instinctive judgments. Many modern readers react to the daughter's actions with shock, discomfort, or moral condemnation, and these responses are natural. Yet the narrative challenges the audience to pause and consider the factors that drove these decisions. What does it mean to act under conditions of total isolation, trauma, and fear? How do societal expectations shape choices when alternatives appear absent? Reflection encourages listeners to move beyond immediate reactions and explore the deeper complexities behind human behavior, fostering a more nuanced and empathetic understanding of moral dilemmas. The narrative also invites contemplation of circumstance itself as a shaping force in human action. Lot's daughters were responding to a world that had been violently transformed, a reality in which their personal agency was bounded by fear, cultural obligation, and the necessity of survival. Reflection asks listeners to consider how context influences morality, and to acknowledge that decisions often arise not in a vacuum, but in a landscape defined by extreme pressures. By engaging with this perspective, viewers are prompted to examine the ways in which their own decisions are shaped by context, and how ethical clarity may be complicated when the conditions of choice are constrained by urgency, responsibility, or necessity. Divine judgment is another element that emerges in reflection. The biblical text does not provide an explicit condemnation of the daughter's actions, leaving space for interpretation and contemplation. This absence encourages the audience to consider the nature of divine oversight. When God does not intervene or speak, what does that imply about moral boundaries, human responsibility, and the unfolding of history? Reflection in this area is not about producing definitive answers, but about developing the ability to hold ambiguity and uncertainty with patience. It invites viewers to wrestle with the tension between human action, consequence, and divine observation, and to recognize that Scripture often presents moral complexity without simple resolution. Engaging with the story as a catalyst for reflection also includes examining personal moral frameworks. Listeners are invited to consider how they define right and wrong, how empathy, context, and circumstance influence judgment, and how they reconcile ethical intuition with the messy realities of life. By using the narrative as a reflective tool, one can explore the ways in which moral clarity is challenged by necessity, and how understanding the pressures and fears shaping human action deepens ethical awareness. Reflection becomes an exercise in humility, recognizing the limits of one's own perspective while cultivating sensitivity to the complexity of human experience. The story further encourages contemplation on human resilience and the moral dilemmas that accompany survival. Lot's daughters were acting under what they perceived as absolute necessity, and their choices remind the audience that moral decisions are often intertwined with the imperative to endure. Reflection allows listeners to consider the balance between ethical principles and survival imperatives, prompting questions about how one might navigate such tensions in their own life, or in less extreme but morally challenging situations. These questions do not require immediate answers, but foster a thoughtful engagement with the dynamics of choice, responsibility, and consequence. This reflective approach also extends to broader societal and historical understanding. The daughter's story is part of the biblical record of human history, showing how individual choices ripple outward, affecting lineage, culture, and the development of nations. Reflection, in this sense, becomes a study not only of personal morality, but of the ways in which human actions influence communities and future generations. It encourages consideration of the long-term consequences of decisions. In essence, reflection invites the audience to engage with the narrative on multiple levels, to observe human desperation, to understand context and circumstance, to wrestle with ethical ambiguity, and to consider divine perspective. By doing so, the story of Lot's daughters becomes not only a historical or biblical account, but also a profound instrument for personal contemplation. It encourages viewers to explore their own values, confront the complexities of morality under pressure, and deepen their understanding of human and divine interplay in ways that enrich both ethical reasoning and spiritual awareness. The narrative of Lot's daughters, though rooted in an ancient time and culture, resonates in surprising ways with contemporary experiences, revealing enduring truths about human behavior under extreme circumstances. When we examine modern ethical dilemmas, situations arise where the pressures of survival, responsibility, and circumstance push individuals toward choices that challenge conventional moral frameworks. Just as the daughters faced isolation, fear, and urgency, today people encounter moments in which ordinary rules feel insufficient to navigate extraordinary challenges. These parallels are not direct equivalencies, but they illuminate how human nature, in its fundamental drive to endure, responds similarly across time. Consider crises where basic survival is threatened, such as natural disasters, war zones, or famine. In such contexts, individuals may make decisions that stretch ethical boundaries, driven by immediate necessity. People may prioritize family survival over established societal norms, act with extreme caution or urgency to protect life, or make choices that, under normal conditions, would seem unacceptable. In these moments, the moral calculus is dominated by the immediacy of need rather than by abstract principles. This mirrors the daughter's situation, where fear and the perceived responsibility to ensure their father's lineage created pressures that eclipsed ordinary ethical considerations. Another modern parallel can be found in medical and scientific decision-making during extreme situations. Health professionals in emergencies, such as triage scenarios during pandemics or natural disasters, are often forced to make choices that weigh one life against another or prioritize urgent interventions in ways that challenge conventional ethics. These circumstances, like those faced by Lot's daughters, highlight the tension between necessity, duty, and morality. They demonstrate that ethical decisions are not made in a vacuum, but are deeply shaped by context, urgency, and the constraints imposed by reality. The narrative also invites reflection on psychological and emotional pressures in contemporary life. People today may confront circumstances in which the stakes are not life and death in a physical sense, but involve profound consequences for personal identity, family cohesion, or social survival. Decisions about career, family obligations, or personal integrity can become morally complex when individuals face conflicting responsibilities or extreme stress. The daughter's story encourages viewers to acknowledge that human decision-making is profoundly affected by internal pressures such as fear, anxiety, and responsibility, as well as by external factors like social expectation, isolation, and threat. The themes of secrecy, isolation, and responsibility in the narrative also echo modern dilemmas in social and professional contexts. For example, whistleblowers or individuals facing institutional pressures may make choices that challenge ethical norms in order to protect others or to prevent harm. These contemporary situations, while not morally equivalent to the biblical narrative, reflect the ongoing relevance of examining how humans navigate complex ethical terrain when conventional rules appear inadequate or when extreme circumstances constrain available options. The story of Lot's daughters further illustrates the delicate balance between moral instinct and practical necessity. In modern contexts, individuals may experience similar tensions when forced to prioritize urgent, pragmatic action over traditional ethical or social expectations. Emergency relief workers, activists, or leaders in crisis often operate in environments where every choice has significant consequences, and where failing to act decisively may result in loss or harm. Their decision-making reflects the same fundamental tension that the daughters experienced: the human need to act in ways that preserve life, continuity, or well-being, even when the actions themselves are morally complex. Another contemporary parallel involves ethical decision-making under societal collapse or rapid change. Communities affected by economic collapse, political upheaval, or environmental disaster often face situations where ordinary social and legal structures are temporarily unavailable or ineffective. Individuals in these conditions must navigate survival, responsibility, and morality in a compressed and morally ambiguous space. The daughter's story helps illustrate that human resilience and creativity are often accompanied by ethical ambiguity, and that understanding such situations requires empathy, context, and historical perspective. In personal and familial contexts, modern audiences can also draw lessons from the narrative about responsibility and the pressures of duty. Caregivers, parents, and family members frequently encounter circumstances in which they must make difficult decisions with limited options. But the narrative also encourages reflection on the consequences of morally complex actions. In contemporary situations, decisions made under pressure may have ripple effects that extend far beyond the immediate moment, influencing communities, institutions, or even broader society. Lot's daughters ensured the survival of a lineage, but the resulting consequences included long-term cultural and historical ramifications. Modern parallels remind listeners that ethical decisions under duress can produce outcomes that are both necessary and morally ambiguous, and that foresight, reflection, and consideration of consequences remain crucial even in extreme circumstances. Moreover, applying this ancient wisdom today involves cultivating empathy and perspective in evaluating human actions. The daughter's story teaches that actions often considered shocking or unacceptable may, in context, represent survival instincts, cultural imperatives, and moral responsibility shaped by extraordinary conditions. This perspective encourages modern listeners to approach ethical judgment with caution and understanding, recognizing that behavior cannot always be evaluated in isolation from circumstance, fear, and responsibility. It underscores the importance of contextual moral reasoning, a skill that remains vital in navigating contemporary ethical dilemmas. The narrative's modern relevance also extends to societal and cultural discourse. It challenges viewers to reconsider simplistic interpretations of right and wrong, and to appreciate the nuanced interplay between human frailty, moral responsibility, and circumstance. By examining extreme cases like the daughter's story, modern audiences are invited to explore ethical principles not as static rules, but as dynamic frameworks that must contend with the unpredictability of life, the pressures of survival, and the limitations of human perception. In essence, applying ancient wisdom today is about using the story to inform moral imagination, empathy, and reflection. It is about understanding that extreme circumstances, whether historical, personal, or societal, can push human behavior to extraordinary lengths, that ethical reasoning is inevitably intertwined with context, and that survival, fear, and responsibility shape decisions in ways that challenge simple categorization. The story encourages audiences to engage with moral complexity thoughtfully, to consider the interplay of necessity and ethics in their own lives, and to cultivate a reflective approach to both historical narratives and contemporary dilemmas. By drawing these modern parallels, the narrative becomes more than a distant historical account. It transforms into a tool for examining human behavior, ethical reasoning, and the profound ways in which circumstances shape choice. Listeners are invited to reflect on their own experiences, empathize with the pressures others face, and appreciate the resilience, creativity, and moral complexity inherent in human decision-making across time and culture. The story of Lot's daughters, though ancient, continues to illuminate the timeless interplay between fear, responsibility, necessity, and ethics, offering lessons that remain deeply relevant in the modern world. Engaging with difficult texts, such as the story of Lot's daughters, offers a unique and profound opportunity to enrich both spiritual understanding and ethical awareness. These passages, often uncomfortable and morally complex, push the boundaries of our reflection, challenging us to confront aspects of human nature, culture, and divine interaction that are rarely straightforward. Avoiding such texts might preserve immediate comfort, yet it also limits the depth of insight one can gain. The value lies not in condoning or dismissing the actions described, but in grappling with their implications, understanding context, and allowing the narrative to provoke thoughtful contemplation of morality, responsibility, and human resilience. Challenging Scripture functions as a mirror to the complexities of life. By presenting scenarios that defy simple categorization of right and wrong, it encourages readers and listeners to hold space for ambiguity, to wrestle with ethical tension, and to cultivate empathy for the human experience across time. The daughter's story is a prime example. Their actions can provoke immediate discomfort, yet within that discomfort lies the potential for profound learning. Difficult texts force us to ask questions that are uncomfortable yet essential. How do fear, isolation, and cultural expectation shape decision-making? How does one navigate morality when circumstances constrain options? What does divine silence or absence indicate about the nature of judgment, responsibility, and human agency? When Scripture presents morally challenging scenarios, it encourages spiritual growth by refusing to offer easy answers. Unlike narratives that celebrate heroes in a simple moral framework, these difficult passages confront the audience with complexity and ambiguity. This complexity mirrors real life, where people rarely face decisions in a vacuum, and morality is often intertwined with necessity, survival, and imperfect knowledge. Engaging with these texts cultivates the ability to reflect critically and ethically, developing a nuanced understanding of human behavior and a capacity to respond with empathy and discernment rather than judgment alone. These texts also highlight the importance of historical and cultural literacy. Understanding the context in which events occur deepens insight and prevents superficial moralizing. The story of Lot's daughters is situated in a time when lineage, survival, and family continuity held paramount importance, and actions were interpreted through a cultural lens vastly different from that of modern readers. Engaging with the text in its historical and cultural framework allows for a richer comprehension of the pressures and responsibilities influencing human action, and it teaches the audience to appreciate the ways cultural norms shape ethical decision-making. Moreover, difficult scripture provides a space to reflect on the human condition with honesty and without idealization. Stories like these acknowledge that human beings, when confronted with extreme circumstances, act from a combination of fear, hope, instinct, and necessity. They reveal the interplay between vulnerability and resilience, illustrating that morality in practice often contends with competing priorities. By engaging with such narratives, listeners are invited to confront their assumptions about virtue, wrongdoing, and divine oversight, and to consider how ethical reasoning operates under real-world pressures. The spiritual value of wrestling with challenging texts lies in the cultivation of humility. Difficult scripture teaches that understanding morality, divine intent, and human action is rarely straightforward. By sitting with discomfort, pondering ambiguity, and exploring multiple perspectives, audiences develop patience, discernment, and empathy. These qualities are essential for ethical growth and spiritual maturity. The story of Lot's daughters, in particular, offers a lens through which one can observe the consequences of desperation, the nuances of responsibility, and the intricate interplay between human choice and divine allowance. Engagement with challenging passages also enhances ethical imagination. By studying extreme scenarios, listeners are prompted to consider moral dilemmas that may not arise in ordinary life, but that illuminate the principles and tensions underlying everyday decisions. Reflection on the daughter's actions encourages a more flexible and sophisticated ethical reasoning. How might one respond when norms are disrupted, when survival is at stake, or when societal structures fail to provide guidance? This kind of imaginative ethical exercise is invaluable, enabling modern audiences to navigate moral ambiguity in both personal and communal contexts. Additionally, engaging with difficult texts reinforces the importance of discernment in interpreting scripture. Rather than reading superficially, audiences are encouraged to ask why the text includes particular narratives, what lessons might be drawn, and how these lessons intersect with both historical understanding and contemporary application. The daughter's story, preserved without explicit moral judgment, emphasizes the interpretive role of the reader or listener, inviting active engagement, critical reflection, and spiritual inquiry. There is also a relational aspect to engaging with challenging scripture. By wrestling with morally complex passages, listeners cultivate a deeper empathy not only for the individuals within the narrative, but for the broader human experience. Difficult texts illuminate the emotional, psychological, and cultural dimensions of human life, revealing that actions are rarely simple, motivations are often layered, and consequences are intricate. This awareness nurtures compassion, allowing modern audiences to approach others with understanding rather than condemnation, recognizing the pressures and constraints that shape human behavior. Difficult scripture further enriches spiritual practice by modeling resilience in the face of ambiguity. Faith and ethical reflection are not strengthened by only encountering clarity and comfort. They grow through grappling with uncertainty, confronting questions without immediate answers, and embracing the complexity of human and divine interaction. The story of Lot's daughters, with its moral ambiguity and historical specificity, invites listeners to participate in this process, to learn patience with themselves and others, and to deepen their understanding of how divine wisdom interacts with human frailty. Finally, the value of engaging with difficult texts lies in the cultivation of a reflective, contemplative mindset. Instead of consuming Scripture as a series of lessons with predictable moral outcomes, audiences learn to sit with tension, ambiguity, and discomfort, allowing insight to emerge gradually. The story becomes a vehicle for exploring human nature, cultural pressures, and ethical complexity, as well as for understanding the nuanced ways in which divine guidance and human responsibility intersect. By approaching challenging passages with care, curiosity, and empathy, listeners develop spiritual and ethical frameworks that are both richer and more adaptable, capable of holding complexity, uncertainty, and the weight of real-life moral dilemmas. In this way, the narrative of Lot's daughters demonstrates the profound value of engaging with difficult Scripture. It reminds listeners that avoidance of discomfort limits growth, whereas reflection, analysis, and contemplation offer opportunities for insight into human nature, morality, and the interplay between divine presence and human action. By immersing themselves in challenging passages, audiences cultivate wisdom, empathy, and discernment, enriching both spiritual understanding and ethical practice, and discovering that even the most unsettling stories can serve as sources of profound insight and guidance. Even after reflecting on the complex moral, cultural, and historical dimensions of Lot's daughter's story, there remains a quiet, almost paradoxical lesson in the midst of its darkness. The narrative confronts us with fear, desperation, and human choices made under extreme pressure, and yet it also offers a window into resilience, responsibility, and the ways in which human beings navigate impossible circumstances. Approaching the text with an open and contemplative heart allows these lessons to emerge, revealing that even stories which initially shock or discomfort us contain profound insights about the human experience, morality, and divine presence. The darkness of the story does not diminish its value. Rather, it magnifies the richness of reflection it invites. By examining the daughters' actions, their motivations, and the consequences that followed, we come to appreciate the layered realities of human life. People are often faced with dilemmas where options are constrained, outcomes uncertain, and moral clarity elusive. Recognizing this helps cultivate empathy and patience for ourselves and others, allowing us to hold space for complexity instead of insisting on simple judgments of good and evil. The narrative becomes a guide for understanding the pressures, fears, and responsibilities that shape human choices across time and context. This story also gently reminds us that moral lessons are not always obvious or immediate. Insight often arises not from condemnation, but from careful observation, reflection, and openness to nuance. By sitting with the discomfort the story provokes, we can better understand the ways in which culture, circumstance, and survival imperatives influence decisions. In doing so, the narrative fosters both spiritual growth and ethical sophistication, encouraging audiences to engage thoughtfully with questions of human behavior, morality, and divine oversight. The quiet strength of the text lies in its invitation to contemplation rather than judgment. It teaches that even in moments of extreme despair, human beings act from a mixture of hope, fear, and responsibility, and that the consequences of such actions ripple outward in ways both immediate and long-lasting. The story invites us to consider not only the characters within it, but also ourselves, our assumptions, and the ways in which we navigate our own ethical and moral challenges. Ultimately, Lot's daughter's story demonstrates that darkness in Scripture is not merely to be feared or avoided. It can illuminate resilience, provoke ethical insight, and cultivate empathy for the human condition. By approaching these narratives with patience, curiosity, and an open heart, we allow even the most difficult passages to enrich our understanding of humanity, morality, and the interplay of circumstance and choice. In the quiet reflection that follows, we recognize that profound lessons often emerge from the places we least expect, offering guidance, perspective, and wisdom that resonate far beyond the pages of the text itself.